Unlike Nike shoes, genetic alterations could actually make you jump higher. And unlike those TV ads for random workout equipment, genetic alterations could actually make you stronger without you really moving a muscle. This week, we want to focus in on recent debates in and the future of bioethics by examining biomedical and genetic therapies and enhancements. We want to begin with understanding the various proposals that are being made for genetic and other biomedical interventions. Specifically, we want to know the who, the what, and the how. First, who is being altered? In particular, an adult human making a voluntary decision to receive an intervention may raise different issues than the case of altering unborn children. Both proposals are on the table, but it is important we recognize the similarities and differences to ensure the sorts of concerns we are raising are applied appropriately. For instance, we could think that an adult human electing for a procedure was less problematic, or not problematic at all, compared to an unborn child being altered because the child didn't consent, since it literally couldn't consent, whereas the adult did. Second, we want to ask what is being altered. As we saw in the various readings, what is being altered may make a large difference on the morality of the alteration. There are three main categories of alteration: physical, mental, and moral. Physical alterations would include interventions aimed at preventing or curing a disease, such as a genetic therapy to remove or alter a gene that predisposes someone to Huntington's disease. But altering to increase or decrease height, to rule out or select eye color, or to determine sex would all also be instances of physical alterations. Mental alterations are a major driving force in this field, both in hopes of curing or slowing mental deficiencies due to various illnesses, as well as the hope of making people more capable of accomplishing tasks. Mental alterations tend to focus on three categories: focus, which is the aim of current interventions like Ritalin or Adderall; memory, which is a major part of research into cures or treatments for Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases; and reasoning, which is more speculative but would focus on people being able to reason better with the information they have, sort of like Bradley Cooper's character in the movie Limitless. So far, research has found a link between blood sugar and reasoning ability, indicating that low blood sugar, as when you are very hungry, can diminish your ability to reason well, which is why you tend to select the really crappy food when you're really hungry. Finally, moral alterations are a very interesting category related to mental alterations. In moral alterations, the aim has been to find ways to make people more likely to cooperate with each other. For instance, research shows that people with higher IQs tend to be better cooperators, so mental and moral alterations would go hand in hand. Also, other sorts of moral enhancements include promoting particular moral emotions, such as sympathy, to make people more sensitive to others' needs. And finally, there is the question of how people are being altered. For non-genetic biomedical interventions, such as Ritalin, of course the delivery method is not unusual. It's like a pill. But for genetic alterations, there are at least three ways to deliver the alteration. Pre-implantation selection, which is what Savulescu focuses on, is like what is happening in the movie Gattaca. Multiple embryos are examined prior to implantation into the mother's womb, and one is selected based on the various criteria. There really isn't an alteration here so much as a selection from among choices. But as far as direct alterations go, there are two ways that can be done, and they may raise different concerns. Somatic genetic alteration would be the most likely type of alteration we would use for humans, as the genes are transferred into the body of the person and the alteration is not transferable to descendants. Germline genetic alteration is more common with non-human animals, but can be done with humans, and that involves modification of germ cells, eggs, and sperm, and such alterations would be heritable by a person's descendants. So you might think, for instance, that somatic genetic alteration for a voluntary adult is less problematic than germline genetic alteration of that very same adult or of an unborn child. Throughout all of this, it is important to remember that many genetic interventions are not, and cannot, guarantee the relevant change, especially in genetically altering children. What the interventions do is minimize or maximize predispositions to various traits that are undesirable or desirable. Your genes limit what you can be in many ways, but they do not tend to limit what you can be to a single thing. Through interacting with your environment, your genes get expressed in a particular way rather than another way that could have been expressed were you in a different environment. It's important to keep that in mind. Things like sex we are determining, but other situations like height are not fully determined merely by modifying genes. With these various proposals and distinction in mind, we can begin by digging into the most important distinction in the moral debate over biomedical and genetic enhancements: the distinction between a therapy and an enhancement. At first glance, it seems that this distinction is quite clear. Therapies would include things like alteration to ablate or cancel the gene which predisposes someone to Huntington's chorea, a debilitating and fatal disease. Also altering genes to all but rid humans of the possibility of asthma. In both cases, we naturally see these as therapies because we naturally see what they are getting rid of, Huntington's or asthma, as illnesses, diseases, as bad and undesirable. Enhancements, on the other hand, are intuitively those sorts of interventions that alter things that are not clearly undesirable or not clearly diseases or illnesses, predisposing a child to musical talent or to increased height. While some people may prefer to be musically talented, it isn't clear that it is better for everyone to be talented at music, whereas it is easier to say it is better for everyone not to have asthma. Similar with height. Many people may want to be taller, and there are reasons to think it is good. For instance, taller people are more likely to get jobs because we unconsciously associate being tall with being successful, but we don't clearly see being tall as absolutely better for everyone, unlike not having Huntington's. But as every author we've read this week has said, or at least alluded to, things get a little more difficult when we look at less clear cases. Take the example of human growth hormone, or HGH. HGH is a naturally occurring hormone and contributes to our growth over time. Some people are deficient in HGH, or for other reasons may be smaller both in terms of height and general body size than what is average for his or her sex and age. HGH injections can be used to increase size, and has been used by some physicians as a treatment for less than average size in children. However, you may be more familiar with the use of HGH in professional sports and bodybuilding, where it is used to increase size beyond the average of the general population, as well as speed up muscle growth from working out. The general social perspective on such use is that it is wrong, but it is the exact same substance being used without concern to treat people of less than average height. So one reason the line between therapy and enhancement can be fuzzy is that sometimes whether we think something is intuitively a therapy or enhancement is context sensitive. As Glannon indicates, if the HGH is used to treat a child whose height deficiency is limiting his functions or opportunities, then it is rightly called a therapy. Otherwise, it is rightly called an enhancement. But of course, even the limitation of functioning or opportunities is context sensitive. In baseball, where supposedly many players are using performance-enhancing drugs, if a person elects not to, it may significantly limit their opportunities to compete at the highest levels of baseball. However, it wouldn't necessarily limit their opportunities more generally. Another reason the line can be fuzzy is because of appeal to things like normal functioning, or average, or typical levels of a feature. The average height of a male in the United States right now is 5'9.5". So in deciding whether or not to give a child HGH, we would try to determine how close he would get to 5'9.5" without intervention. But average height has changed over time, and changes throughout the world, as the average height of an English male in 15th century England was a little under 5'6". Now that is not a huge difference, as height hasn't radically changed, but the general point is relevant. What is considered normal or average can vastly change throughout time. Now if we see someone who is illiterate, we think that is unusual and something that should be fixed. Normal people are literate people. They know how to read. So teaching someone to read, by this standard, would be a therapy. But it wasn't too long ago that it was much more common for people to be illiterate, as literacy was only found among elites and often only religious figures who worked hard to prevent the populace from being able to read religious texts, so that they were dependent on the religious figures for interpretation. On this same standard of returning people to average, teaching someone to read would have been an enhancement in those times. So while it may not be hard to figure out what is the average now and just use that as the dividing line, given that it is constantly changing, the question we want to ask is why should it be a dividing line at all? Why does what is normal at this time get privilege if it is just going to change next year anyway? So now that we have a basic idea of the therapy enhancement distinction and why it is a difficult distinction to make clear, it is also important to understand why we need to make it clear. Legay, in her article, discusses why the distinction matters, and Glannon, in his, also makes an important point about how some people want to use the distinction. So the distinction is relevant in at least three ways. First, as Legay hints at and Glannon is very clear about, the distinction matters because it may divide what should and should not be a part of medical practice. If medical practice is about therapies, and enhancements are relevantly different from therapies, then enhancements have no place in medicine. On the other hand, if there is no distinction, or the distinction is not morally relevant to medical practice, then medicine can be engaged in both. Second, both Legay and Glannon discussed the matter we saw illustrated in Gattaca, a concern over unequal access. As Legay makes clear, if we call something an enhancement, it is unlikely that it would be easily accessible by most people, since it would not be subsidized by the government nor covered by insurance. But if something is called a therapy, then it is more likely it will be more readily accessible by more people, although there is by no means a guarantee it would be accessible to all people. Finally, related to both of these previous issues is the issue of research and funding. If enhancement is not relevant to medicine, then various funding streams for biomedical research, including government funding, would not be available to research of the technologies. Of course, just because something is called a therapy doesn't guarantee it gets funding, and of course there's plenty of funding streams for things that aren't therapies at all, but certainly funding streams for biomedical research are at least available if the thing is truly a therapy. So it matters whether there is a therapy enhancement distinction, and it matters how exactly we make the distinction. Similar to the killing letting die distinction from last week, however, the issue is not merely is there a distinction or not in some sense, but in a sense that is morally relevant. Is there a difference between the two, therapy and enhancement, that matters morally? Legay gives us various ways of trying to make the distinction, but she doesn't necessarily take a stand on whether there truly is a morally relevant difference or not. Glannon, on the other hand, argues that there is a distinction and that it is morally relevant. Therapies fit within the goals of medicine, enhancements do not. Interestingly, both Legay and Glannon make use of Norman Daniels' formulation of the standard medical model to define therapy, as well as both use the example of interventions into the immune system, such as vaccinations, to make their point. Vaccinations are an interesting case because many, such as those quoted by Glannon, use them to support the claim that there is no distinction between therapy and enhancement, while others, such as Glannon himself, use them to argue for the distinction. Vaccinations, generally, are one of those gray areas for the therapy enhancement distinction, so we should keep it in mind as we evaluate the various ways people make the distinction or argue that there is no distinction. We will start with Legay's four-part distinction. There is therapy, enhancement, prevention, and remediation. Therapy, for Legay and Glannon, is best defined by Norman Daniels as an intervention designed to maintain or restore bodily organization and functioning to states that are typical for one's species, age, and sex. Enhancement, on the other hand, is an intervention aimed at improving upon normal organization, appearance, health, and functioning, trying to take them beyond typical levels. Preventions are close to therapies in that they are designed to maintain health, but they do so sometimes in a way that involves atypical functioning, such as a much better immune system than is average due to inoculation, but they also aim at minimizing the need for future therapies. Finally, remediation alters traits to bring them nearer to the typical, but does so independent of any disease or illness. For instance, giving HGH to a person who is genetically predisposed to a less than average height may constitute remediation rather than therapy, because merely being short is not a disease or illness. What is interesting about adding two additional possibilities is that these possibilities are themselves contentious. While prevention is generally seen as part of medicine, remediation is generally not. But as the HGH example indicates, maybe people are doing it, using remediation for height, but are calling it therapy. While adding prevention and remediation is useful for clearing up some of the issues, what we will mostly be focusing on is whether or not the sorts of interventions standardly called enhancements fit within the scope of therapy or prevention, or something else that we may say fits within the goals of medicine. And of course, Glandon thinks that enhancement does not fit with the goals of medicine. For him, there is a distinction to be made between therapy and enhancement, and it is one that forms a dividing line between what is morally appropriate for physicians to do and what is not. Using basically the same definitions as Legay, Glandon argues that enhancements are outside the goal of medicine. The goal of medicine, as he understands it, is Norman Daniels' classic view that medicine aims at maintaining or restoring mental and physical functions to or at normal levels for the purpose of ensuring fair equality of opportunity for all people. Given this understanding of medicine, it is quite clear why Glandon thinks enhancement is outside the scope, since it seeks to go above and beyond normal levels. To argue for his position, Glandon takes on the issue of vaccinations to conclude that they are a form of maintenance, or perhaps preventions in Legay's terms, but certainly not enhancements. While one could say that vaccinations enhance the immune system, Glandon's point is that when determining whether something is an enhancement or not, we need to look at the whole system, in this case the whole human system. On that basis, an enhancement of the immune system is simply maintenance of the human system, because the immune system's job is to protect the human system from infectious agents and help ensure its survival. Enhancing it, by making it better capable of rejecting and fighting off infectious agents, doesn't change its job, and so it doesn't take it above normal levels. The point of Glandon's discussion of vaccinations was to deal with the concern that there is no clear distinction between therapy and enhancement, since sometimes enhancements are used to prevent disease. That is one way of arguing that there is no clear distinction, but our old friend Julian Savulescu goes a different route. For Savulescu, the reason there is no distinction between therapy and enhancement is because the goal of medicine isn't merely about maintaining or restoring normal functions. Rather, it is, at least in part, about ensuring the best life for people. That, at least, is the basis of beneficence, which is a component of medicine. We can motivate Savulescu's approach by asking the following question. Why are diseases and illnesses and other such medical problems bad? Why do we call them problems? What is it about them that makes us want to avoid them and makes us want to treat them? There may be two natural responses to this question that are ultimately unsatisfying. The first is that it is because they are diseases or illnesses that they are bad. But that is unsatisfying, since we can call whatever we want a disease or illness. Insofar as we think we are picking out something important by calling something a disease or illness, it must be something deeper than merely the word. There must be something that all diseases and illnesses have in common that makes them a disease or an illness. Second, and this would perhaps have to be Glandon's response, is that diseases or illnesses or anything like that as a medical problem are abnormal, and that is why they are bad and we want to change them. This would certainly fit with his understanding of the role of medicine involved with getting people to normal levels. But this approach is also unsatisfying. If 90% of the population had asthma, would asthma no longer be bad? If 70% of the population had cancer, would we no longer want to try to avoid and to treat cancer? Absolutely not. And that is because what is bad about diseases and illnesses, what makes us want to avoid them and to get rid of them, is that they negatively affect our well-being. They prevent us from living the best life we possibly can live. And they do this if we are the only one in the world that have them, and they also do this if everyone has them. So if medicine is concerned with treating diseases and illnesses, and we want them treated because they prevent us from living the best life, then the goal of medicine, at least for Savulescu, is to help us in living the best life through particular sorts of interventions. But if this is the case, then so long as things other than diseases and illnesses, such as height, can affect my well-being, and a physician has the means to fix my height, then certainly the physician should fix my height, or at least doing so